Hello, ducklings. A year and a half ago, I think, maybe a little bit more than that, I made a video. That is a terrible video. I will link it, but you probably shouldn't watch it because it was the first kind of long form attempt that I'd ever done in trying to film, and I fucked up horribly. The footage got corrupted in the save. The color correction got completely messed up. My tone and my pitch was weird because I was still learning how to talk with the camera pointed at me, and frankly, I still don't think I'm very good at it, but you know, I appreciate people who come and hang out with me anyway. And yet, for all of that, it's a really important video to me. It's the Tradwife rant, and I made it in response to an article that had gone viral in US but international media, profiling a Tradwife influencer who has since gone on to new and interesting business scandals. But the reason it was so interesting to me was not just because of that one article, but I had been fascinated with Tradwife content for a hot minute by that point, and I just wanted to talk about it because that's what I do. Like I said, I will link it. I don't encourage you to watch it necessarily because I don't think it's terrible. It's not very good, and yet I do think the substance of it is solid, and I wish I had made a better video at the time, but this is kind of a weird do-over opportunity because I want to talk about a specific piece of media with you today. This is something very new for me. Normally when I talk about books, I do my sometimes monthly, more recently quarterly reading dump where I just take you through my story graph report and I talk about all the things that I've read, but I want to do something a little bit differently this time, and I want to focus in on one book that I've read recently. Because, number one, I really liked it, and it has stuck with me for a while, ever since reading it. And number two, it dovetails on an area of media and content that I have expressed interest in the past, and I think my past thoughts and this current piece of media go together in some interesting ways that have to do with pop culture and also current moment in 2026. The book I want to talk about is Yesteryear by Caro Burke. Whenever I try to say her name, I always flip things around in my head, but Caro Burke. God, I am so sorry, Miss Burke. You have probably heard about this book at this point. It has been making the media rounds. It has been in NPR and on the New York Times and in the Paris Review of Books. It has been in the Guardian, and it has been featured, I think, in the Telegraph. And more than that, there has been discourse around this book. There have been conversations around this book, its publication, its content, its themes, everything. This is a book that people have wanted to talk about. I've casually referenced before that booktok scares me, and it does. Booktok scares me. This is not a booktok video, but booktok is not irrelevant to this conversation because TikTok is not irrelevant to this conversation. But yes, booktok is another area where there has been a lot of hashtag discourse about this book because it's doing something very interesting. Yesteryear is the debut novel of Caro Burke, and she came out of the gate swinging, man. This is a book about a Tradwife influencer. This is not the first book of its type. And first and foremost, I want to talk about why I think we're seeing so much fiction about Tradwives now, because if you haven't noticed, there has been something of an upsurge in the publication realm. For the last couple of years, there have been a number of books that have delved into Tradwife influencer culture, Tradwife culture, and the media system that surrounds content creators in the Tradwife space. These are not all the same thing, and that's a crucial thing to remember for this whole video conversation. As I've said, there have been a number of books published recently in the last 18 months, but it's fascinating to me what kinds of books have been published that use Tradwives as main characters or as settings. It's mostly been genre fiction. It's mostly been thriller, true crime, crime fiction, or horror. That's not by accident. But we will come back to this if I can loop all my thoughts together successfully. Yesteryear is not that. Yesteryear is literary fiction. It doesn't have a single fantastical element in it. And I bring that up because I think that is the point of this book. If I could summarize my not very good in delivery, but still in my opinion good in terms of bare bone fundamentals video on Tradwives, my points would be these. Tradwife content as an aesthetic isn't real. It's cosplay. Costumed role-playing, effectively. And the mostly women who engage in it are not accurately portraying homemaking, much less homesteading. In fact, I argued that one of the emotional itches that I think that this kind of content scratches for people is, number one, it's idyllic looking. It's very aesthetic. It's beautiful. And when I say they're cosplaying, what I actually mean here is that they're being very, very inauthentic. Most of the kind of content that they create, the kind of activities that they show themselves walking through, whether it's making bread or growing food from scratch or homeschooling their children, is meant to evoke a kind of false nostalgia for a time that didn't really ever exist, at least not in the way that it looks, not on screen. Most of the prominent Tradwife influencers were projecting a very, very highly curated aesthetic look. They were and remain very, very traditionally, generically beautiful. They tend to be white women. They tend to be thin women. They tend to be wealthy women. And I think that wealth is a really underrated part of this whole conversation. In fact, I invoked Marie Antoinette playing shepherdess at La Petite Tyrannon as a really good example of what a lot of this content actually is. It is a fantasy of a simpler life, usually indulged in by people with a degree of privilege or status or wealth that already insulates them from a lot of problems. Point number two, when we're talking about hashtag Tradwife content, we are talking about a specific genre of media, and we need to think of it as a genre of media. It has specific tropes, it has specific story beats. It has a specific aesthetic that is designed to appeal to an audience. It is quite literally a performance that is meant to attract the attention and the admiration, and in some cases, the money of a specific group of people. And I want to be clear, it's okay on some level to just enjoy this content for the visual presentation that it is. Pretty people doing pretty things prettily. That's fine in isolation. But I think it is adjacent to a few other things. And in that video, I think that is the first time I used the analogy of the Venn diagram, which I brought up in my last dog park video that I filmed, where you can exist in multiple circles at the same time. A lot of people find their way to Tradlife content out of an interest in sustainability or homeschooling or any number of things. And taken as an individual idea or an individual concept, it's fine. But as I mentioned in my dog park video, you have to be very, very aware that you're swimming in waters with fellow travelers. And Tradwife content sits alongside a lot of other kinds of content that has frankly been used or leads to a certain radicalization of thinking. It's not inevitable. Just because you enjoy it or like some of it does not mean you will end up that way. But for many people, Tradlife content is not a destination, it's an on-ramp. Point number three, Tradwife content is a business. When I say that they are performing, I mean it. And most performers, except the pure artists among us, don't work for free. In the influencer economy in which we all live, people get online and perform work for an audience that appreciates that work. Everybody does it. Again, as a phenomenon, it's fine, right? But I think it's really important to remember that for the majority of people consuming this content, the lifestyle that is actually funding the life of the people they see on the screen is not ranching, is not produce farming, is not sourdough baking. You know, the thing that mostly powers their life is the production of content. When you look at and watch Tradwife content, particularly the most successful influencers among them, you are looking at a small media empire with production teams, production values, with an editorial calendar, and with a production system designed to create all of the media that you are consuming. In other words, it's very easy to mistake a lot of things on TikTok or a lot of things on Instagram for being authentic when they aren't. They are just as manufactured as any other TV show. And in my opinion, we need to therefore apply some media criticism lenses to this kind of content when we encounter it in the wild. It's a business. It's not a documentary. It's a reality TV show. Briefly, let's talk about publishing, because I think all of these books that have come out kind of within an 18-month time frame together is not by accident. But books take a lot of time to create, as opposed to something like social media, which can be filmed, edited, and uploaded sometimes in a single day. Books take time. If you are a new author, you frequently have to write an entire book, including multiple drafts and edits, possibly with readers or, friends or loved ones doing some of that editing work for you, providing you that reader feedback, you writing and rewriting your manuscript over and over again before you query it. You send it off to an agent to evaluate the saleability, the marketability of what you've created. If you're lucky, they will buy your book from you, but that doesn't mean you're done, unless you are a towering genius. And even then, you are then going to go through multiple rounds of other edits with professional editors who are going to help you refine your work. They will help you make changes. This might be to make a plot point work better or to make a characterization clearer. It may also be to make your work more marketable to an audience. They will suggest changes, in some cases very big ones, to take what you have created and turn it into a product. I'm not saying this to denigrate publishing in any way, shape, or form. I have ARC copies on my reading shelf over here that you've sometimes seen in the back of my rant chair videos of early print runs or early drafts of one of my best friends, H, who is a multiple time published author and is a brilliant, brilliant woman. And I have been able to be a beta reader for her many, many times over. This isn't to diminish the beauty or the value of book writing. It's to explain that it is a process that takes time. Whilst you're going through the editing, your agent is trying to sell your book onto publishers, people who will produce the physical copy of the book and probably the e-copies and help you distribute it to sellers. That can take months or years. Most publishers have an existing backlog of books, a catalog that they are already in business agreements with the authors to publish at any given time. So if you are lucky enough to sell a book, you are coming in at the back of a pre-existing queue. Now again, those publishers are businesses and they might make changes to their publication and production and distribution schedule to better fit with a trend that they notice in media, or something might come into vogue, a new trope or a new genre. We've all seen this again with the whole booktok conversation. Different tropes, different authors, different genres come into and out of vogue all the time. And the big publishers are able to somewhat adapt their schedules to bring a planned book forward or move it back to better meet the moment as it arises. But there's no getting around it. It takes a lot of time to write, edit, pitch, enter into contractual agreements, produce, distribute, and promote a book. It takes months and or years depending on your particular batch of skill, editorial team, and sheer dumb luck. A lot of the books that we're seeing published now will have been pitched or sold years ago, meaning that the books that we're seeing now were probably being pitched at the height of the Tradwife social media content trend. That trend has not gone away. It is still with us, but it has kind of morphed somewhat, even since the time that I made that video. It's gone from being less of a TikTok trend to be gawked at in some cases or opined on in others, or just, placidly enjoyed by many, all of which are fine. But things have happened since then, right? A few final comments on the whole publishing side of this. When I look at the book publishing landscape and the kinds of books that have been published in the last 18 to 24 months that use Tradwives as the main character or as the setting in some place, something really jumps out to me. Most of them are murder mysteries, thrillers, or horror novels. Those are all pieces of what, I would call genre fiction, meaning that there are typically certain kinds of story beats and tropes that are typically come in those kinds of books that you, the reader or the audience, kind of know what you're getting into. Generally in a murder mystery, for instance, it is very atypical for the mystery to not be solved at the end, right? It does happen, but that's a subversion of expectations. Otherwise, you kind of know what you're going to get into. There will be an incident, an inciting incident. There will be a death. The main character is typically, though not always, the detective or is somehow investigating the incident. And by the end, you, the reader, are brought in on the secret. That's a generic kind of murder mystery. Think Agatha Christie. All genres have these kinds of story beats and tropes. They range wildly, as I talk about all the time in my romance content. There are subgenres and subgenres of subgenres, and there are tropes that only really apply to certain subgenres. Like, no one book is any one thing, and within any genre or trope is tremendous talent and range of imagination. When I talk about genre fiction, I am not using that term disparagingly in any way. I love it. I love genre fiction. I enjoy it tremendously. But it's not a mistake or incidental to me that most of the books that have come out about Tradwives have fallen into this kind of category of genre fiction, mostly crime and or horror. That makes sense to me because most of the authors who are publishing those kinds of books are themselves women. And I would argue that there's a lot to be horrified about in the whole discourse around Tradwives. Which brings us to Yesteryear. Yesteryear has some elements that seem to borrow from these other genres, but I personally would not describe it as a thriller. I wouldn't even describe it as a mystery, although there are deeply mysterious elements about it, which maybe we'll get into if I, recap some of the book. It's not any of that to me. It's literary fiction. It is a first-person narrative of a woman named Natalie who becomes a Tradwife influencer, and events ensue. The book Yesteryear goes into how Natalie got to this point. What were the circumstances that encouraged her along this path, made it feasible for her, why it would appeal to someone like her, why it would appeal to the audience that she attracts, and how this does or does not end up warping her own sense of reality in living in this kind of space. The pitch for Yesteryear is very simple on its face. The blurb might read something along the lines of, Tradwife influencer Natalie has the perfect life. She lives on this beautiful ranch with her handsome husband and her half-dozen children. She milks the cow and collects the eggs every morning. But what the audience doesn't see is that she has, I think, 2 nannies and a production assistant, and her husband's not really a competent rancher. He keeps killing the livestock. And she's the actual breadwinner for the family. In spite of her kind of chirpy online personality, she is a deeply unlikable kind of character. At least when we, the audience or the readers, are inside her head and hearing how she talks about her life and how she talks about her audience and how she even talks about her own children. And then, living in this weird sort of gilded cage as she is, one day she wakes up and she doesn't recognize where she is. Yes, this is still her house. The layout is the same, but when she opens the cupboard, there's not a fridge there. There's just wooden shelves. And there's a bunch of children that she feels like she recognizes, but they're not her children. And there's a man coming towards her in a cowboy hat, looking like something straight out of the 19th century. And he looks like her husband, but also he doesn't look like her husband. And what's going on? And where is her stand mixer? And where is her staff? And what she finds herself in is the actual reality of a 19th century sort of homestead. The narrative of the book goes back and forth between these 2 realities. Natalie telling the story of how she got to her influencer life, and Natalie finding herself in this kind of weird, twisted, is it an alternate reality? Is she in a prank show? Is someone harming her or filming her or put her in this cage to drive her crazy? Like, she doesn't know, but she is living this split life, and we, the audience, are living it with her. the mystery element of the book is this real? If so, how did it happen? How did we get here? How did she get there? Is everything as it seems? Has she time traveled? Is she in a prank show? Like, what is going on? That's the plot. That's the plot of Yesteryear. Natalie, through her first person narrative, details how she got to the point that she did. She indicates that she was raised in a very, very religious home environment. Her father left the family at some point, so she and her sister were raised by her mother, who was very devout. She ends up going to, I think, Harvard, a very, very prestigious school on, I think, academic merit, but she herself is almost ostentatiously devotional in her approach. She doesn't believe in evolution. She doesn't believe in a lot of things. And as she tells her story, she talks about how, she stands out in these settings and what her experiences are, particularly with other women, where she finds herself kind of in these antagonistic relationships where her roommate is a fundamentally different kind of woman who is having a more typical university experience. She's hooking up, she's drinking, she's doing a lot of other stuff that Natalie, the main character, just completely looks down on her for, doesn't understand, and has no desire to participate in. Then at university, she meets a charming young man and they get married very young, and she gets pregnant almost right away. He, it turns out, is the son of a state politician with grander federal aspirations. At first, things seem to be going swimmingly, but then, as Natalie describes it, her husband has something of a failure to launch. She describes her husband, Caleb, as kind of lacking ambition and focus, which she wants to encourage him through to start, but very quickly runs out of all patience with him. And the narrative of the book changes very, very abruptly in a lot of ways as Natalie, in her telling again, comes to this realization that her husband is kind of this aimless, feckless, unimpressive man, and she has hitched her wagon to him, pun intended, for the rest of her life. She talks about him watching huge amounts of porn, failing to look for jobs, not really having any kind of ambition towards anything that she would admire or respect. In fact, the one thing he says he would be interested in, and the narrative kind of tells us he might be very good at, is childcare. He enjoys playing with young kids and minding them, and briefly voices that maybe he would want to be a teacher or like a kindergarten carer of some kind. And Natalie is having none of it because that's not what men are supposed to do, right? So she enters into this sort of gentleman's agreement, and I use that gendered language on intentionally, with her father-in-law. He kind of knows that his son isn't really up to the task. He and his wife, who is herself, heavily dosed up on alcohol and medications, a la Betty Friedan's worst version of a housewife, they know that their son is kind of unimpressive, again, in Natalie's telling. And Natalie kind of says, all right, well, he's my problem now, so I will have to make something of him. And it is mostly through her force of will and her influence that they buy a ranch in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what they're doing. He gets on a bunch of forums, which will become relevant later, and she starts posting on social media about her perfect life, while underneath, the narrative tells we, the reader, that she is increasingly seething with resentments, that she is so frustrated by her husband's stupidity, as she tells it. He learns everything there is to know about farming from the blogs and from the forums, and it kills like a succession of dairy cows because he doesn't know how to care for them. He is very bad at growing things and incompetent at selling them, and seems to be using probably illegal day labor, to make the ranch work. Meanwhile, Natalie keeps having more and more children and realizes she needs help. So she hires, again, I think 2 nannies, and eventually she hires a young woman to help her produce her social media content specifically, because it's clear that that has become the financial engine of this family. She is supporting them. Her husband, Caleb, is providing the ranch backdrop, all of which has been financed by her father-in-law, who wants the benefits of what seems to be a good salt of the earth, ranching farmhand for a son. Because of how it will help his political career and how it will play to his audience. So a lot of things are happening in this story. Caleb is increasingly radicalized by his online activity because again, my Venn diagram thing, the kind of content his wife is creating appeals to women in a certain way, but also appeals to a certain kind of man. So because he doesn't always realize the Venn diagrams of how media works, Caleb finds himself slipping more and more not just into homesteading spaces, but survivalist spaces and religious extremist spaces. This then reflects on how they choose to educate or not their children. This in turn seems to impact how his father positions himself for future political office. It absolutely influences how Natalie chooses to package and sell her content online. The kind of audience that her whole family has been shaped to curate to becomes more and more extreme. Something that I think is so smart about Yesteryear is that it just lays all of this out, that none of these individual things happen in a vacuum. That in order to create the character of Natalie, and for Natalie to create the kind of media empire that she does, you need elements of religion, you need elements of politics, you need elements of online life and culture, you need elements of consumerism and capitalism, because someone's got to make money by selling products somewhere, right? You need the understanding that social media is not reality, but feels like reality, often scratches a particular emotional itch for some people, and provides both escapists and aspirational kind of fantasizing for some people. That two different people can look at the same content, the same beautiful picture of a beautiful woman in a 1950s house dress, and for some people they'll go, oh, that's pretty, and for some people that will be closer to fetish content than anything else. That there's this idea of false nostalgia for a time that didn't actually exist, because as we see when we pivot to the other half of the narrative, where Natalie is seemingly stuck in the 1900s, that the reality is a lot more grim. Natalie, when she has these flashes into this, homesteading reality, as opposed to the one that she cosplays for Instagram and TikTok, brings her memories with her, shall we say. So she wakes up and sees all of these children that she doesn't recognize, and she immediately notices how bad their teeth all are. They don't have dental care. They don't have medical care. She herself seems to have woken up having damaged her leg in a trap in the woods that has been hastily stitched together by a girl claiming to be her daughter. So her foot has been permanently mangled, and this limits her mobility around the house. She only has a couple of items of clothing that she has to rotate to, as opposed to her beautiful closet of 400-pound cashmere sweaters that she normally gets to leaf through every day. The reality of the lifestyle of homesteading in the 19th century is, to paraphrase Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. There is nothing aesthetic about it. It is grind. It is pure work all the time, particularly for the women. Natalie and the two girls who she understands in this world to be her daughters are constantly busy and are constantly expected to be busy. And Natalie is not good at all of the tasks that she has to do, because churning butter by hand takes hours. Her husband disappears off into the field every day and comes back occasionally with, meat and vegetables sometimes, but she doesn't see him. And the book does not shy away from the grimmer aspects of this dynamic either. It's made clear in the book that she can't refuse sex with her husband, which makes for some uncomfortable reading from time to time. As you move through the book, Burke does an excellent job of ramping up the tension, of making the audience want to know what's going on, because one day in the 19th century, Natalie finds something on the ground, and she is positive that it is plastic, that is the piece of a microphone, something she remembers from this other timeline that she's supposed to be in. And the tension of the book is her trying to figure out how she got into this environment, what the mechanism of that is she being held there against her will? Why doesn't she know what happened to her? The flips get more and more chaotic, in my opinion, and closer together as we move through the book. Natalie's tensions with her children in either kind of reality ramp up and up. Her frustrations and her confusion with her husband ramp up and up and up, and everything kind of reaches a breaking point when, in our reality, the one we would understand, it turns out that the woman she hired to be her assistant and production assistant has been having an affair with her husband, and tells her, Natalie, that she and Caleb are going to run away together. Also, Natalie, has a confrontational conversation with this young woman, and it's clear to her that this young woman doesn't actually love Caleb, that Caleb is kind of latched onto her as another escape route, as he did to Natalie originally. This young woman forces Natalie to just kind of have this confrontational clash of how unappealing she actually is, how cruel and vindictive and selfish and small she is as a person, and how this woman, who she looks down on, actually kind of pities her, and Natalie snaps. She physically attacks her and nearly strangles this woman in just a blind rage before kind of coming to, letting her flee, and making a call to her father-in-law to help her clean up the mess, because her father-in-law has leveraged his daughter-in-law's online clout, the connections that his son has formed in these various overlapping Venn diagrams of media to appeal to a certain kind of voter, shall we say, and has launched his bid for the presidency. So if this scandal were to come to light, that this influencer's husband left her for her assistant that nobody knows she even has behind the scenes because of the lie that she sells on social media, this could derail his aspirations as well. Natalie, crucially, kind of misrepresents the scenario to her father-in-law, so he brings in the lawyers and the media to try and help her, and eventually her story unravels. The young producer sells a narrative to the media that does not align with the one that Natalie has been telling, but is very sympathetic to her, the assistant, and turns the internet on Natalie, which brings us to kind of the great denouement. It turns out that after all of this happened, after the internet turned on her, after her father-in-law understood that Natalie had misrepresented this attack situation with her assistant, when her husband recognizes just how violent she was able to be, when all of her reality comes crashing down on her, Natalie has something of a psychic break and deletes her internet presence, and through the help of her father-in-law, she and Caleb up sticks and actually move out into the wilderness and start actually living the life that she's been pretending to live this whole time. So the narrative jumping back and forth is her mind kind of flickering in and out of lucidity, but both are real, both are reality. It's just in her authentic homestead life, she's much older, she's had more children. She and Caleb live off the grid, kind of. It actually turns out that Caleb is cheating, and he spends the whole day hanging out with some of his adult sons, watching football with them and bringing groceries home. But she, Natalie, has honestly thought that she's been somehow trapped into the 19th century, because otherwise they live off of the grid. And she has borne additional children in this situation, the youngest of whom is developmentally delayed because of complications from a home birth. She went from performing this kind of lifestyle for the cameras to actually living it with a psychic break in the middle. In the final chapters of the story, her adult daughter, her firstborn child, who has distanced herself, who literally moved away, who escaped, gets the courts involved and basically takes custody of her younger siblings to take them away from Natalie and Caleb. And Natalie and Caleb are left in their off-grid homestead, hating each other, resenting one another, but still kind of weirdly connected and attached to one another, and kind of asking, what now? There is an epilogue, and the epilogue is, it's kind of like Ian McEwan's Atonement, in the sense that it then shifts the narrator. The narrator becomes Natalie's eldest daughter, Clementine, who has written a book about her experiences, and the epilogue is kind of the first chapter of that book, which is dedicated to Natalie, her mother, and kind of explains how she and her siblings are doing their best to craft a life after truly horrific circumstances that will affect them for the rest of their lives. And that's it. That's Yesteryear. It is not a comfortable book. It is not, I would say, a pleasant book. And I'm not surprised that the discourse around this book has been somewhat mixed. Some people really enjoy it. Some people absolutely hate it. But somehow it still evokes strong feelings. I'm not surprised. The plot is uncomfortable. It is fractal. It is difficult to read on purpose. You're meant to be confused by parts of it, because I would argue Natalie herself is a deeply unreliable narrator. This happens to be one of my favorite tropes. I love an unreliable narrator. But it quite literally means that you can't really trust anything that that character has told you. When I finished the book, I was left wondering, wow, was Natalie's upbringing truly as strict as she told us? Or was just this how her brain received it? Was Caleb, her husband, actually as repulsive and feckless as she portrayed him as, or was that her perspective of him? One of the things that I think is so fascinating about Natalie is that I would in no way describe her as a heroine. She's the main character, she's the protagonist of the book, but she's not a hero or a heroine. She doesn't get the same kind of story beat. She doesn't get the same kind of narrative structure as a more traditional hero or heroine would. She's not a likable character. Her brain is a very toxic place to be. As she narrates her early life experience, her university experience, she is constantly looking down on, disparaging, criticizing, or self-congratulating compared to other women. She has real contempt for the women who surround her. She couches this in a lot of religious context and experience and a lot of religious language about how misguided feminism is, how sad all of these women are who are making such poor life choices compared to her. But there is a seething resentment that comes out in all of this that is very, very well written by the author. As time goes on and as the story becomes more fractal, Natalie becomes even more unlikable. She's hostile to other people. She's inauthentic with other people. She doesn't seem to bond well with her own children. She doesn't even seem to like her own children. The vibe that I get from reading the book is that Natalie is a narcissistic kind of personality type. And that kind of jives with what I think it must take to be an influencer at some level. At some level, you have to think well enough of yourself to promote yourself in the way that I think social media influencer requires as a career. It's kind of like how not everyone is built for the stage, right? Like there are some people in this life who are genuinely really thoughtful, charismatic, interesting performers, theater kids, we would call them. And not everyone has the personality type that is attracted to that kind of work or is even very good at it. Kind of like how Caleb, it seems, is probably attracted to and would excel at things like teaching or working with small children. But because of the political, social narratives that he has been raised in with his parents and that he has opted into with Natalie, and he's probably projected on himself, he never even considers that as an option. He's constantly trying to force himself into a mold of something he doesn't actually fit in naturally, and it's tragic. It's tragic. This whole book to me is deeply, deeply tragic. And the tragedy of Natalie's character is very, very layered because even though I really don't like her as a character, she's not supposed to be likable. I'm supposed to be equal parts kind of repulsed by and intrigued by what she's going through. But I think the author in this book does a really good job of laying out the impossibilities of kind of modern womanhood where the narratives that you have can be so self-contradictory at times that it doesn't matter what you choose. It doesn't matter if you choose to be a homemaker, if you choose to pursue a career, if you choose to partner, if you choose not to partner, if you choose to have children, if you don't choose to have children. No matter what you do, you will find yourself cultivating enemies almost without trying. Right? That there is no possible way to exist in the world as a person, I would say, but as a woman, without attracting a high degree of criticism. And if you are a narcissistic personality that seems to crave love or attention or respect or what have you, criticism is the one thing you can't handle. And when your narrative about yourself collapses, it can legitimately produce a psychic break. In many ways, even though this book is about, Tradwives are a wholly modern phenomenon, at least in the way that we use the hashtag. It is a genre of content about performing a kind of femininity that appeals to a specific, I would say, largely male gaze, or at least male-centric gaze, performing heterosexual, heteronormative kind of reality set in a false past that never actually existed in the way that you think it did. Like, it is such an artificial creation in every single way. And this book is about one woman trying to force that falseness into a reality, and it literally breaks her brain. It breaks her family. It breaks It breaks the community that surrounds her. It breaks literally everything because it is inherently unsustainable. And for all of that, I'm glad that this book is coming out now. Although I kind of wish publishing did not take as long as it did, because I think in some ways the culture could have used this book a lot sooner. Why do I think that? Well, a long time ago on a previous website, I wrote about the first Trump election. And I wrote about how worried I was about it, not necessarily because of Trump himself, because I viewed and still view him as a kind of buffoonish, clownish figure, malignant, but also like he himself couldn't exist in isolation. It was the people and the ideologies that he had deliberately surrounded himself with and attracted that I was afraid of. I was specifically afraid of the far right-leaning groups that had congealed around him. Again, that was in 2016. Maybe I'll link that piece somewhere if you want to go back and read my old blog, but I still think of that as one of the more important things that I've ever written just for myself, because we're still dealing with that problem now in 2026. 10 years on, Trump is in power again, but the people who have surrounded himself this time are not just that, they're even more extreme versions of that. The first Trump administration rose largely off of social media influence. That was something that he and his strategists deliberately cultivated. And the way that I put it in that piece is that you can't cosplay fascism. It's not something you can pretend. At some point, fascism becomes what you actually do in the world. And my concern was that there were a lot of people who, whether it was, edgelords online, trying to be provocative and edgy and, countercultural, were becoming more and more deliberately offensive. Number one, it got them attention and engagement. And number two, it felt transgressive. It felt countercultural in a way that appeals to certain personality types. But what I argued in that piece was that you can only pretend for so long before you have to embrace some of those things genuinely. And I would argue in 2026, a lot of what has happened in American politics and media has been people who started cosplaying as something actually turning into the thing that they started out pretending to be. I think this is true of J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. We have people like Elon Musk or, a lot of other tech CEOs who for a long time positioned themselves as these kind of libertarian, alternative culture kind of people and pushed it so hard that they've libertarianed their way straight into oligarchy. And, to connect this, I think we have some people who, for clout or attention or money, pretended to be ethnocentrists, white nationalists, and religiously extreme kind of personalities online so long that that's what they've ended up becoming. That is a route or a path to power and influence for so many people. And again, my argument was you can only pretend for so long. Either you have to commit or your reality breaks. And we're living in a moment now where a lot of things that were trending on social media 10 years ago, 2 years ago even, have manifested into reality. The same week that I finished Yesteryear, Turning Point USA had their women's conference. If you don't know, Turning Point USA is the activist organization that was headed by a young conservative media influencer named Charlie Kirk until he was assassinated last year. It is now headed by his widow, Erica Kirk. She is a fascinating media figure in her own right because she's not very good at media in a lot of really critical ways, but I finished Yesteryear just as this event was happening and clips from it were starting to circulate on social media. And what happened at this event is that Erica Kirk and a lot of the other influencers like her are up on stage selling merch and promoting a political agenda to young conservative women about, how their place is in the home, how they should be reliant on a male relative, a father, a brother, or eventually a husband, how they need to align their lives by certain ideological principles. And the things that stuck out to me were the clips from the attendees themselves who clearly actually believe these things. I saw clips of young women saying, oh, I don't think I should vote. I'm happy to give that right, or the right of our household, to my husband to represent us. Or women advocating for homeschooling or the complete dismantling of departments of education or other things, because it's their role to educate their children. I'm summarizing this and simplifying it, but the whole thing was so fascinating to me because it was yesteryear. It was a bunch of women up on a stage getting paid a lot of money to pretend like they aren't the very kinds of women that they're decrying. These are career women. These aren't homesteaders. These aren't homeschoolers. These women are some of the most privileged women in media. Their children go to private schools. They travel on private jets. They own multiple homes and have multiple properties. Their partners, if they have them, tend to be men of wealth and influence. They're quite literally quoting scripture about women being silent in public from a podium being broadcast all over the internet. Like, I don't have to point out the irony to anybody. But again, it was that fractal reality between the difference of what is packaged and marketed quite literally as a product, as a media environment, ecosystem, or show, versus the actual demanded reality. Because if we were to live in the reality that the Tradwives and the most politically loud of the influencers would have us do, the truth is, it wouldn't look like paradise. It wouldn't. We know that it wouldn't. We have a lot of recorded human history to demonstrate that it wouldn't be like that. And yes, this weaponized nostalgia, this desire for a simpler world, this desire for a world in which you don't have to think about complexity is so appealing and understandably appealing that people are willing to live in, and in many cases construct a false reality in which to do it. This is not a perfect book by any means. I actually think that the last third of it sort of dragged on in a weird way. I also personally, in many ways, found myself very unsatisfied by the ending. I think that's because I kept waiting for the genre media finish. I kept waiting for the moment where Natalie would break off the chains of oppression, or something would happen that would, pull back the curtain and we the audience would understand what was going on. And the truth is, it doesn't. This book doesn't end, I would say, in a particularly satisfying way. But the more that I sit with it, the more I conclude that it's the only way a book like this could end. This isn't a murder mystery. This isn't a thriller. It's not a crime novel. And it's not a novel with a hero. The ending this book gives us is exactly what would happen if a character like this person made the choices they did. The only way it can end is badly. So while this book is coming out in many ways at a good time in 2026, like I said, I kind of wish it had come out 2 years ago at the height of the Tradwife influencer craze, because some of the people who are loudest about actually wanting those kind of political realities for women are now in positions of material power. They're not on TikTok selling us pretty dresses. They're wandering the halls of Congress and the White House, what's left of it. They're influencing British politics and media in some very, very specific and troubling ways. And yes, the influencer culture is still alive and well. It does seem to be shifting though. And maybe that's a whole other video in its own right. Because as I started, there are trends in media. There are waves. It might not feel like it, but there was a time before social media influence was even a career option for most people, and I'm convinced that there will be a time like that again. But the kind of height of the influencer wave, I think, might have crested, and people are moving on to different kinds of careers. A lot of the most famous influencers have retired or stepped back. A lot of OG YouTube creators aren't making content in the same way. Some have disappeared from the internet altogether, and you know what? Good for them. Because the alternative, I think, is more aligned with what happens with Natalie. You either have to play a role forever, which breaks your brain, or you have to give up, which might break your brain. This is a complex book. It's not a comfortable book. It's not a perfect book. Like I said, I think that the third act needed some elements edited down or out to streamline the delivery of it. But this is an author who I'm curious to see what she does next, because she is not afraid to tackle very big and very complex ideas and themes and mostly deliver on it. Have you read this book? Have you read any of the other kind of Tradwife character content that's come out recently? The other book that really features a Tradwife that I have read recently was the mystery thriller Everyone is Lying to You by Joe Piazza, which I really, really enjoyed, and was the first kind of book of its kind in this kind of subgenre that came to my attention. And I thought it was a fun mystery and thriller. But Yesteryear is not that. It is very much a literary fiction book. And so the vibe is very different. In my bit of prep that I did for this video, I found a lot more books like this that have simply not come to my attention. So I will link a lot of the articles and the think pieces that speak to the rise of Tradwife books in particular, and the character of the Tradwife, or the setting of the Tradwife or influencer media as kind of an environment. Do you like them? Do you think this kind of character works best in genre media? Or if you've read Yesteryear, what did you think about Natalie as a deeply, deeply unlikable protagonist? There's a whole other video in me somewhere about the difference between a hero and a protagonist, because they are not always the same thing. But I don't know. This is a book that I'm going to be thinking about for a long time because of when it has been published, when it's come out, the moment that we're in, and also the moments from 2 and 10 years ago that helped us get to this point anyway. Those are my thoughts on Yesteryear. Let me know if this kind of deep dive into a single book is at all interesting to you. And if so, what other currently pop culturally relevant books you'd be interested in these kind of deep dives into. I love talking about things that make me think, and this book really made me think. So if you haven't read it and anything that I've talked about today piques your interest, give it a shot. I'd be curious to your takes. If you hated this book, I'm curious to hear your takes, because I'm not going to argue with anyone who couldn't stand it. There's a lot to dislike about the book, but I don't think that you can argue that this book is bad. Thanks for hanging out with me in a kind of new to me way of recording and thinking and working. And as always, kittens, I really enjoy hanging out with you. Thanks for spending time with me.